Welcome back to another discussion of the economy. Now, before we begin, I would like to make it clear that I am very pro-capitalist. I think that capitalism is the best and most effective type of economy in the world so far. However, it's not perfect because people run the capitalist society, and no people are perfect. Unfortunately, capitalism does have drawbacks, and we should not be blind to those. So, in this slide, I would like to look at some of the weaknesses of capitalism, how to fix them, and why capitalism is still better than other types of economies. The first weakness of capitalism is actually also one of its strengths, and that is it highly prioritizes money and getting things, stuff, materialism. Now, I say that's a weakness, but what kind of economic system does not prioritize getting money and stuff? Well, not a very effective one. So the very thing that makes capitalism extremely effective at getting money and stuff also is one of its weaknesses because it then deprioritizes things like humanity, charity, empathy for your fellow citizen. It's very much self-focused. America encourages charity by giving tax breaks to those who give to charity. I think it's very telling that in a capitalist system, we have to be paid in order to give. What kind of system is that? We ought to be willing to give with nothing in return. We often, as Christians and maybe more on the right wing, value human life, and yet I've known many right-wingers who are not willing to help pay for other people's life. I've known people like in this comic, they're very much pro-life, say we'll do whatever we can to protect your life, but as soon as that baby is born, I'm not going to lift a finger to help you. You're on your own, single teen mother. Get a job, moocher. Hope you don't want food stamps. And then sometimes these young ladies are in a very tough position where they're being told that they ought to keep the baby and yet cannot financially support that baby. Hey, if we are pro-life, we ought to be willing to give to help people survive. Jesus had many things to say to the Pharisees who told other people what to do, and they were giving them rules to follow and yet would not help them follow the rules. He said they're like people who bind heavy burdens on their backs but won't lift a finger to help. If you're telling people to keep their babies, you ought to be helping them do whatever it takes to give that baby a good life. Now, I know this can be a very touchy subject, but we should be concerned with life not only in the womb, but also as infants, as children, as adults, and as the elderly. Programs that help women,
Capitalism
infants, and children
emphasizes individualism and freedom,
and once again, that is a strength. Super capitalists, ultra right wingers say, well,
capitalists
individuals
ought
to be helping
charities,
each other,
churches,
pioneer farmers of the old west,
a local
community
life
shelter,
pretty much by themselves.
That is a solution.
Was
2 days walk away, and they
individual
charities
all by
themselves. Really a capitalist idea.
That's wonderful.
Capitalism says
but
just
we have
make
to
the
remember
money
that
and
with
keep
freedom
the money
comes
yourself.
responsibility.
So whatever the solution to
typically
these
a
social
capitalist says, well,
problems
if I
are,
make poor choices,
they're going
that
to
I'm only
require
hurting
money.
myself.
But that's
Either
not
money
always
given
true.
freely
Sometimes
or
my
taxation.
economic choices hurt the people around me. What should we do to those who shirk their responsibilities? Well, I would say if they're only hurting themselves, leave them to their own devices. If they choose to waste their money, well, tough luck for them. But what if their lack of responsibility hurts other people? For instance, their own children. Jesus said that even unbelievers understand that they have a responsibility to their children. Or maybe that was Paul. I think that was Paul, actually. If you do not provide for your children, you're worse than an infidel. You ought to be providing for your children. And what happens when there is a family that is not feeding and clothing their children, getting them adequate, health care or education, and the community sees this problem? Should the community step in to help? Even if it's the parents' own fault, the parents are making bad decisions. Well, I think the community does have a responsibility to help these children. What about buying safety features or not buying safety features? If you don't pay for a safety feature, you might be endangering the society around you. And that's like drunk driving. You might say, well, it's my choice to get drunk. Well, it might be your choice to get drunk, but if you choose to get drunk and then choose to go behind a wheel, you could kill people. And so society needs to put a stop to that. In the Middle Ages, fires were such a common occurrence that if you were not careful with your fire, you could be executed for that. There are many examples of fires destroying whole cities and killing many people. I think of the Great London Fire of 1666, destroyed like three-quarters of London. It was absolutely terrible. And that was most likely caused by someone who left their fire burning a little too hot at night, did not cover it up with ashes. And so he didn't just burn down his own house, he burned down most of the city, caused untold economic damage. Well, I think it's plain to see that we have a responsibility not only to ourselves, but to our neighbors as well. And if we do not spend our money wisely, that could be very damaging. Employers often do not want to pay for expensive safety equipment. Why should I pay for that? That's coming out of my bottom line. But who's going to make them? In America, the government makes employers buy these hard hats and other safety equipment, kill switches. That's not a capitalist thing for the government to tell people what to do. Is it worth it? I would say absolutely it's worth it. Of course, it can be taken too far, but typically the government has to step in and tell the bosses to spend money on workplace safety. The lone wolf mentality can be very, very damaging. You are your brother's keeper. This phrase is kind of a joke in the Old Testament. Abel is called a sheep keeper, and God basically says, "Cain, have you seen the sheep keeper?" And Cain says, "What? Am I a brother keeper?" And the answer is yes. Yes, you are. You have a responsibility by God to look after the people around you. The Good Samaritan had a responsibility to the stranger that he saw beaten up and dying on the side of the road. You do have a responsibility, even when that responsibility takes your time and your money. It's not a capitalist idea, but it is a godly idea to spend your money on other people, not just yourself. In a capitalist society, more so than other societies, money is power. Now, in every society, to some extent, money is power. But in some societies, the money is so tightly controlled that there just aren't that many people who are richer than everyone else. The rich in America can exploit the system and can cheat and find loopholes to get even richer. There are so many tax loopholes that exist so that rich people end up usually not paying nearly as much as they're seemingly supposed to pay. Whether they shift their businesses to a different country, or they keep all their money in an offshore bank account, or all sorts of different ways to buck the system and not pay really what they're allowed to pay. You can also spend millions of dollars to hire lobbyists to tell politicians what to do, and that is extremely effective. We looked at that in our government class, just how effective lobbying is. Those with the money to pay can buy a politician. You could also spend millions of dollars on funding their campaigns. It takes a lot of money to become elected in America. That's not how it's supposed to be. The founding fathers did not spend millions of dollars on ad campaigns, but you have to do that in America even to be recognized as a legitimate contender. H.J. Heinz was one of my personal heroes, super cool businessman. He is a Christian, and he started his company with some amazing ethics and decisions that no one else was doing. There was no minimum wage at the time, but he decided that it was fair to pay his workers about double what everyone else was paying. No one was making him. He just thought it was fair to pay more than he had to. There were no workplace safety laws, but he decided that it would be ethical, it'd be the Christian thing to do to make sure that his workers are safe. He even did things like making sure there were many large open windows in his factory so that his workers can get plenty of sunshine and a nice cool breeze wafting in the factory and good weather. He even made housing for his workers that he gave them at very low rents. And then he would make community buildings for his workers where they could go listen to concerts at a concert hall, listen to the piano, or read a book in his library, and he just gave back to his workers in his community to an amazing degree. He also made a very controversial decision to put all his food in clear glass bottles. See, everyone else was using dark colored brown or green bottles so that they couldn't see all the sawdust and other food additives that was being put in their food. And Heinz said, we will always make pure, good food, and we're going to sell it in clear glass bottles so the customer can see that they're buying what they think they're buying. Well, as he was becoming more and more effective and more popular, and his business was growing, there were all sorts of lobbyists who were asking for workplace safety laws and food and drug laws. And one law in particular was a law that started basically the FDA and USDA that was going to send the government to inspect food processing plants and make sure that you weren't putting rat poison and sawdust in your food. And all these food makers were bucking at that system, saying, no, we don't want the government looking in our factories. And H.J. Heinz said, I welcome food inspectors. The government can come look in my factory anytime. It is the cleanest place you'll see. We clean constantly. We're washing our hands. There's plenty of sunlight. All our food is fresh and delicious. Come and look at our factory. We have nothing to hide. And it was largely through H.J. Heinz that we got these non-capitalist laws where the government gets to look at your food and make sure that it's safe for the consumer to buy. Now, Heinz was going against his own capitalist self-interests. It would have made him more money to put sawdust in his food, but he didn't care. It was going to cost him money to have food inspectors look at all of his food. He didn't care. He was willing to spend money on doing the right thing. That's the way a Christian business owner operates. Another question that comes up when we say, oh, money buys power in America. Well, what should the alternative be? How do you stop people from spending their money on what they want to spend it on? Is it fair to tell a rich person what he may and may not buy? That is the complete opposite of freedom. Can you think of any political system where the poor have more power than the rich? That's simply a fact of life. And even if you don't like it very much, that's just how money works. People with money can buy things. People without money can't. I would say in regard to lobbying, don't limit the amount of money you can spend, but definitely make it absolutely transparent. There are ways that you can give millions of dollars to politicians and no one knows where that money comes from. And I think that should stop immediately. We ought to know who is giving money to which politicians, so that any bribery can be easily found. Now, corporations do have lots of money and they could buy TV ads and campaigns and posters and things, but corporations don't have any votes. So at the end of the day, even though a corporation might give millions of dollars to a re-election campaign for someone, it is the people of America who vote yes or no on them. So make things transparent so that if there is someone being bribed by Big Ketchup, you know about it. Capitalism can ignore or exploit whoever is not part of the capitalist system. If you don't buy or sell things with me, well, then I have no use for you. And there's many examples of that in the age of colonialism, where Westerners met up with natives, and the natives didn't have much for the white people to buy or sell, so they are outside of the capitalist system, and we don't have any use for you. The poor are largely outside the capitalist system. They're not producing much, they're not buying much. We don't want anything to do with that. Anyone who's outside. In America, when the colonists came over, what did the Native Americans sell? They sold some furs, and they sold land, and that was highly desirable. But land is a one-time purchase. So as soon as you buy it, well, then what else do I need from you? Then white people started trapping, and the more white people trapped, the less we needed to buy from the Indians. So again, there's one of the few things that the natives were providing for the capitalist system, and that's dwindling. So what use do we have for you right now? And then the natives didn't really buy a whole lot from the English, the French. They bought muskets for sure, but they did not go over to a capitalist European lifestyle. They weren't buying the food and the clothes and the tools and the houses and the land. They just weren't being a market for the capitalists. Today, things happen where we buy things from other nations that have terrible workplace safety and health standards. And that is a way that we are exploiting people who are outside of our system. This is a picture of an iPhone factory in China where they had so many suicides because the work hours were terrible, the pay was terrible. Communist China did not allow them to pick a different job. You had to work something like 12 hours a day. It was very dark and it was very dangerous in there. There were metal filings all in the air and people were getting lung problems. They started jumping off the roof. And so what was the solution? Put nets so that no one can die by suicide. That doesn't really fix the problem. However, once pictures like this were circulated throughout America, Americans protested and Apple stepped in and said, well, we're going to make sure in the future that all of our factories are paying their workers fairly and have better health standards and things like that. But this is not limited to iPhones. This is true of so many products we buy from overseas, clothing and shoes especially, where these people are being paid next to nothing. They're basically slaves, and America is profiting off of that. Pretty terrible. Women in the past have not been part of the traditional economy. They're not the ones who are going shopping, and they're not the ones bring money home from work. They're doing all their work at home, and their husbands are the ones who are buying a lot of the products for them. So their opinions were largely disregarded in the economy. I think it's strange that back in the day, many women's products were advertised to men to buy for their wives. And so they were often designed by men, made by men, and sold to men to give to their wives. And so sometimes these products were not terribly effective because no women were consulted in the making of these products. And, well, that's not cool. And of course, one of the darkest chapters in our history, slavery. Slaves were outside of the economic system. I will note that in Rome, many Roman slaves were given a job where they were actually given a wage as well. So it wasn't classic slavery like we think of in America. It was more, you must work for me, but I'm still paying you. Some of these slaves became very successful business owners themselves. So they bought and sold things. Many of them became professional entertainers. Many famous Greek plays were written by slaves. Many actors, even gladiators, and then business owners were slaves. Many professors were slaves. And they would often become really part of the economy, and so they were well respected and had some measure of power. American slaves were almost completely outside of the economy. They lived on their master's land, and it was really the master who had all the economic impact. Income inequality is becoming more of a hot topic issue in America today, and capitalism does support more income inequality than other systems. Income inequality simply means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or at least the poor don't have the opportunity to thrive. And as much as America would like it, poor Americans don't have the social mobility that we wish we had. If you look at this chart on the right, it looks at how much money the richest people in the country have. The top 1% earn what percent of the GDP? So in America in 2015, the top 1% earned almost 20% of the money in America, meaning 99% of America made only 80% of the money. Now compare that to some European nations. The United Kingdom is, around 12%. Canada and Germany are right around the same. If you go further down, France is a very socialist country, and its top 1% are only making, 7% of the money in the country? Much less income inequality. Then let's see here, Japan and is that Italy? Italy is also rather socialist, and you can see the results there. The rich don't get terribly rich in a nation like that, and the poor aren't as poor, or at least that's the hope. That isn't always what happens. In America, after the Civil War, when slavery was banned, a lot of people turned to sharecropping. Sharecropping was a system where the farmers rent the land from the landowners, and the farmers are paid with a share of the crop. Now, it seems like a pretty smart method of payment. Many farmers today, they get paid by their crop. However, in America, it was very unfair because the landowners, would often rent the land for more money than you would make in a year. And there were laws saying you cannot leave the land, you cannot leave this contract until you have paid off all your debt. effectively meaning you must work for this landowner for the rest of your life and you will make zero profit. In fact, every year you're getting into worse and worse debt. There are many southern states that also said that this contract would be passed down from father to child. And so it's not just you, but it's your children in perpetuity who will be indebted and must work for this man. It is slavery under a different name. Thankfully, today there are ways around that. In America today, you can go bankrupt if you are not making a profit and have no hope of making a profit. Then the court can decide that you can just give up on this contract and not have to pay it back. There are many, many rags to riches stories in America. There are stories like Carnegie, who started off as an immigrant making pennies an hour and just slowly worked his way up through the company until he was one of the richest people in the world, one of the first millionaires in America. There are rags to riches stories. Bill Gates started off with almost nothing, and he started a computer company in his garage, and now he is the richest guy in the world. There are rags to riches stories. America does have some social mobility. If you are born poor, you don't have to stay poor. However, for every rags to riches story, there are so many more rags to rags stories. It's not as simple as simply working hard and you will become rich. Just take a look at the teachers in our school. Doesn't matter how hard they work, they will never be millionaires at this job. There are many other jobs that are very worthwhile that will not pay millions of dollars. Simply working hard and making smart decisions will not always make you a millionaire. Other people have great ideas, but might not have the opportunity to put those in. Even Donald Trump, he said, I started off with a small $1 million loan. Well, good for you. And maybe you did very well with that $1 million loan, but not everyone gets a $1 million loan from their dad. After the Civil War, there were plenty of Black Americans who started their own businesses, who made their own decisions, and some of them were doing very well. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a place that had a lot of Black businesses. It was called Black Wall Street, and they were making quite a bit of money. And unfortunately, the white people of that city got so angry that Black people are becoming rich that they, in one day, they burned down this entire section of the community, shot a bunch of Black people, and ran many others out of town, burning down homes and businesses, basically saying, you want to have your own rags to riches story? Not in my neighborhood. Very, very sad. This is a chart that says, if you were born into poverty, how many generations will it likely take for your family to have an average income? And over on the right, Colombia, if you're born in poverty, it'll take 11 generations for your family to be average. India and China will take you 7 generations to be average. In America, we're right in the middle, 5 generations to go from poverty to average income. And that's not the best in the world. It looks like Denmark has only 2 generations to become average from going from poverty. Notice all these smaller numbers are Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden, some of the most socialist nations, and they are allowing you to rise out of poverty because the government is giving a lot of money in programs to the poor. There is a downside to that, and the downside is once you do get to be average, you will have a much difficult time becoming more than average. It makes you very difficult to become rich in those countries. And what's the alternative to income inequality? Well, just look at Denmark. That's the alternative to income inequality. There are a few poor people, but there's also few rich people because the rich are taxed so much. Capitalism allows for the most social volatility. It allows someone to be starting off at a few cents an hour and then become the richest man in the world. It allows you to start a business in a garage and become the richest man in the world. It also, unfortunately, allows you to invest all your money in a business and go bankrupt and have absolutely nothing. It allows you to be poor and stay poor. Socialism can elevate more people out of poverty, but also has a cap. There's always a downside. There is no perfect society. There is no perfect economic system. Any problem that you fix, unfortunately, does create a different problem. And that's what these social programs create. They fix some problems, but then they prevent other good things. Carnegie believed that millionaires should not be allowed, that if you got to have $1 million, you should be taxed down until you're under $1 million, and that there should be no millionaires in all of America. Just take all their money over $1 million. That's a rather
We can
radical
mitigate
way
or
of reduce some of capitalism's problems with socialist, or should I just say social, programs. Some that are designed to help everybody, and some that only help those who are really in need. Things that help everyone are free public education. Not everyone has children, but everyone was a child at one point. And I know that America's public school system kind of stinks. I do wish it was run a lot better. There were many big changes that I would make. But I do like the idea of making sure that everyone gets a decent education. And education is the number one thing that makes you more valuable as a capitalist, gets you more money. Typically, the better education you have, the more money you can make. It's not always true, but typically. And I am glad that my tax dollars can be spent to educate my kids and neighbors. Tax money often also goes to public libraries and other things that help the community be a nicer place. Things like parks, so you can go and relax and play frisbee with your dog and just have a nice neighborhood. That's always a nice thing to see. Sometimes tax money is spent to check out food and drug companies, make sure that they are safe and effective. I am glad that there are drug laws that make sure that my medicine is effective and is actually what it claims it is, that it won't kill you by taking it. And all that stuff does take money. It takes government inspectors to look at all these things and make sure you aren't putting rat poison in the soup. I am glad that my money is being spent to keep America safe. Often, tax money is spent on taking care of the roads, railroads, other infrastructure, the gas lines, water, electricity. I am glad that just about everyone in America has access to electricity and clean water. Many people are thinking we should put Wi-Fi on that list of essentials. Everyone needs internet access. Maybe one day that will be a reality in America. But none of these things are pure capitalist, but they're not terribly socialist either. We're not going into Bernie Sanders territory by saying that the government needs to make sure there's no sawdust in your food. This is 99% capitalist and 1% social. That's fine. Then there's these safety net programs that are designed to help those who really need it. Without these safety net programs, in a purely capitalist society, if you're in trouble, you are really in trouble. If you lose your job, you lose your home, and you can be homeless, and you can die penniless and hungry on the streets. And life can be absolutely brutal for those on the low strung in a purely capitalist society. So I'm glad that we can help out those who need it the most. And we do that with things like food stamps, heating and housing assistance, unemployment insurance. And I know many people who complain that some people are fraudulent, some people are lazy and need these benefits when they really shouldn't. And yeah, that is true. There's always going to be fraud, and we should absolutely make sure that this money is only going to people who actually need it. But then we should be willing to help our neighbors in this way. I'm glad that Maine has systems to make sure that people don't go cold in the winter. Of all the things that they can spend my tax dollars on, heating my neighbor's house is a pretty nice thing. I'd rather them spend it on that than on 1,000,001 other projects that Susan Collins has in mind. Anyway, we can argue about how much money we should give to what programs, what food stamps, who get what. But I do think that these safety net programs are very, very helpful in America. We are the richest nation in the world, and if we can't afford to help the poorest among us, who can? I think that those who complain that food stamps cost too much don't understand just how tiny of a percentage of tax dollars goes to food stamps. It is a very, very small percentage of your taxes, and it is for a good cause. Usually. There's an example of Maine Pine Tree Card. The problem with fixing these problems like those living on the street and homelessness is that the more problems you fix, the less effective capitalism is. All these problems take money to implement, to fix all these problems. The more you fix them, the more problems you create. So you have to find that sweet spot that mixes the freedom of capitalism and the money-making opportunity of capitalism with also helping the poor. If you go too far to socialism, but not 100% to socialism, you get the worst of capitalism plus the worst of socialism. You get high taxes, which is the worst of socialism, plus ineffective social programs. So they're taxing you to pay for a program that's not very effective. Obamacare was like this, especially in the beginning. It was incredibly high taxes, but it was really bad when it first came out. It took my family over a year to sign up for Obamacare. It was ridiculous how difficult it was. People were not ready to implement that program nationwide. Anyway, we have to find what social programs are effective and how we can help the most people with the least taxes to get the best of both worlds. A capitalist society that allows you to make a lot of money and have a successful business, plus the social ideas of looking out for your neighbor, being your brother's keeper, and having a community that takes care of each other.